to you right now. And actually, if I could have them come up to the, if I could ask for Bo and Madeline, Holly, Gus, and Dan. Okay, this is where we're going to start our conversation. Okay, so I'm going to first introduce you to Dan Ranta. Some of you, I think, have already spoken with Dan today, but Dan is the Director of Knowledge Sharing at ConocoPhillips, where he's accountable for the strategic implementation of knowledge sharing for the 17,000-person independent exploration and production company. In 2004, Dan led a small team charged with developing and implementing a knowledge-sharing strategy for the exploration and production part of the business. Now in its 10th year, knowledge sharing at ConocoPhillips has achieved global recognition as an excellent program, leading the industry while being one of the best KM programs across the industry, Let me also mention that Dan is a Kent State graduate. Dan gets to take home one of those squirrels. In fact, we might get you a bigger squirrel. And let me also introduce Holly Baxter. She's the co-founder and chief scientist of Strategic Knowledge Solutions. She has spent more than 15 years specializing in instructional design, evaluation metrics, organizational development, knowledge management, leadership and development, and training in government, military, and commercial environments. Her experience includes developing knowledge assessment methodologies for improving communication flow and organizational learning across countries and cultures, and designing training to enhance situation awareness in high-stakes situations. She also designs embedded training solutions for enhanced human performance, develops evaluation metrics for cognitively based training, and develops knowledge transfer strategies to accelerate the expertise development cycle. Bo Newman is a principal knowledge management architect at C2 Solutions Group, where he works to continue development and implementation of the KM Services Program model within the public sector. He's the founder and principal investigator of Knowledge Management Forum, one of the first virtual communities of practice in the field of knowledge management. Madeline Blair is the founder and president of Polaron. She is an expert in the fields of organizational development, knowledge management, instructional design, and research techniques. She's published extensively and is the author of Writing the Current, How to Deal with the Daily Deluge of Data, Essays in Two Voices. She teaches business narrative and storytelling and organizational learning for the Knowledge Management Graduate Program at Kent State University. Gus Creedon is Program Manager, Logistics Technology at LMI Government Consulting in McLean, Virginia. He has worked for many federal, civilian, and defense clients. He's responsible for leading cross-discipline teams in functional design, development, testing, delivery, and marketing of web-based software types. In 2013, he continues applying semantic search technologies, OWL and RDF, to government knowledge management challenges. In May 2013, he launched Open Policy version 1.0, and I think you also have a table where you're, if you want to learn more about this. So what we're doing at this point is, these are our stakeholder group leaders. They'll be leading your discussions tomorrow, and they'll be leading panels later today. But Dan is going to host a conversation among the four of them, plus the five of them actually, centered around talent challenges, but also kind of steering our thoughts about these challenges through how a knowledge sciences center might begin to tackle this. Okay? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Denise. Well, we heard this morning from Dr. Honda and from Mills Davis. This topic, I think, is in just networking around the room. This is a very pertinent topic as well. You think about that transfer of knowledge from the experienced knowledge workers that we have to associates. You think about challenges associated with compressing time to competency. In our industry, like a lot of industries, we face major demographic challenges. At this time, approximately 40%, that's a big number, of our workforce is eligible for retirement. And based on our last couple of years of attritions and retirements, we expect to lose about that number, 40% of our workforce in the next 5 years. At the same time, we have big plans to grow around the world. Dr. Hunt, I'm sure that Goodyear has the same type of thing going on. And so that's the question that I think faces a lot of organizations, companies, is that how do you overcome by making the retention of critical knowledge something that is in a daily flow of people's day jobs, so that you can move forward more systematically and ensure that that knowledge, that tacit knowledge, is out there in explicit form so we can find it and reuse it. And I'll start here on my right with Holly. It worked for me, but
I am not the technology person. So I've been asked to kind of speak on behalf of the academic stakeholders here. And so something I want to talk about as we go through and attack some of these questions is, what can we do as an academic community to support some of these questions, both from the research perspective and from the teaching perspective, and helping organizations train their people on how do we do knowledge transfer. And I know we have a number of experts here in the room on knowledge transfer, other than myself. Brian Moon's back there, so we'll call on him later too. But one thing that is good here and that we can really support, and a way that we've learned to tackle this goal, is the first thing, and Bo and I were discussing this, is how do you define a goal for what you want to transfer? And a lot of times one of the strategies is, we really want to go and transfer knowledge. Okay, why and what knowledge? Do you really want to transfer everything the person knows, or is there something special there? So how do we help organizations and help people define, here is the goal, and then not only here's the goal and what we want to get from that person, but what do we want to do with it after we capture it? It's great if you have that knowledge, but who are you going to transfer it to? Because if you're going to transfer it to a novice, you're going to capture a different kind of knowledge from that person than if you're going to transfer it to someone who's mid-career, or if you're going to transfer it to somebody who's at a high level, you're going to focus on more strategic knowledge than operational knowledge. So that's something I'm going to ask the people in that academic stakeholder group. Start to think about what are some ways that we can support the training of that and helping organizations define what some of those goals are. And I am going to pass this off.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Let's go to Gus.
And following Holly's lead, right? Don? Dan. I'm going to be facilitating the technology group this afternoon, and then all day tomorrow. I think that I would call myself a knowledge engineer. I'm not a knowledge scientist. I don't. I used to do some of that when I was younger, coding systems and developing software. But right now, what I'm doing is learning how to collect and what did Dr. Hunt? Collect and connect. That's what I'm doing right now as a main thrust of my career. So from the technology perspective, what I want to do is try and get out of my group how we're collecting information and how we're encoding it into knowledge bases, and then what is the best way to connect using the latest knowledge management technologies.
Okay. Thanks, Gus. Madeline?
Madeline? She has
Madeline.
Oh, I'm
You're in the ballpark way back in the bleacher seats.
Madeline, you gave your heart early.
That's all right. It's a very common thing that people could swap those two names. I won't tell you the other names that I'm swapped with. What was the question?
The question was related to this big challenge that we face with experienced folks in the workforce, and how can we transfer that knowledge? I think that we've sharpened it a bit. I like what Holly talked about in terms of making sure that we have business goals associated with that, so it's a targeted approach. And Gus talked a little bit about how the technology plays a role in enabling that. But so I'm just recapping what they said, because I think collective elaboration is important on this panel.
This is my style, by the way. I always stop to think. I remember when I was going to defend my dissertation, my advisor told the rest of the committee, you just have to wait. And when she's done, she's done. All right. I think one of the areas, and I think I'm responsible for two groups, right? Workers and civil society. So got a double duty here somehow. One thing I want to say, though, is that civil society is not substantively different from corporate America. They just have different kinds of goals. So that while profit may be the goal for a corporation, civil society wants to get funding. So you can see there's a definite relationship there. Workers, however, really have a different perspective on this. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussions around what this can mean to workers. Because today, of college graduates, 40% of them in the first year get hired. The rest do not. So we have a very different kind of time. I remember when I graduated from college, I had a job before I was out of college. When I went through graduate school, I had a job before I got out. So it's very different today. I'm going to talk about that. And yet, even though the millennials know they're going to be changing their jobs, they still have that desire to have a career and to make a difference. That's their big addition, which I think is nice. I recognize that part of it. This aspect of the change of generations when they're leaving, and we're trying to capture from them everything they know. I'm a great believer in the fact that you're not going to capture everything they know, because they don't know all the things they know. It's only through interaction with people that their knowledge comes out. And so one of the things that I'm hoping that the center can do is give us more and more innovative ways in which we can facilitate that kind of conversation. I know when I work with organizations where we're dealing with knowledge retention, we always begin with stories. And we have the person who's leaving telling stories. And even the person who is taking their place telling stories. And they discover all manner of connections through those stories which they never would have anticipated before telling those stories. And they become streams where knowledge can come in, as well as just simply the human interaction, which is what we really want out of those kinds of sessions. We want two people to come to the end of your time with them, and they say to each other, please call me anytime. And we heard that many times. I think that's all I want to say.
So learning through stories kind of provides that contextual layer to help us imagine how we can indeed, as I said, compress that time to competency to learn a little bit faster, or maybe a lot faster.
You've really touched on one of the key powers of story, is that you can't tell a story without the context. You begin with once upon a time in a land far, far away. You know it's a fairy tale. Okay? That's the context of the story. And you can't tell a story about your work until you tell the context of it. And we only learn when we can relate to context in our own context. That's the only time we learn. Even as a college student or a graduate student, you're only learning because you can put it into the context of your needs. So that's why those stories are so critical.
Well, sometimes on a panel, when you're the last one to talk, it's tough. But I think in terms of this particular question and this issue, which we all face, it's probably an easier one because there's still so many opportunities to discuss so many different solutions.
Yeah, and being the last on the panel for me is actually the most enjoyable because I get to key off of everything else. No fresh ideas, but there are a couple ideas. First of all, I'll be facilitating the business interest panel, which I've noticed has drawn considerable interest. And I think it fits, my background differs considerably from these. I came up through this as an implementer and now sit at what I call the confluence of the knowledge sciences, knowledge engineering, knowledge management. I look at the knowledge sciences providing us the solid theoretical foundations and telling us what should work and where it should. The engineers taking those concepts, those methodologies, those technologies, and building systems and approaches that solve the problems that the managers see within their business. And if I fit in there at one specific point, it's probably very close to that bridge between the engineer and the manager. And for that reason, when we approached, and I say we, I did this for a government agency recently, when we approached this problem of knowledge loss, I took a process productivity. How well do, you've got a business process here. You don't want to impact the effectiveness of that process as you transition from one person to another. That became my focal question. So the very first thing we did is, we asked the question, is this knowledge that the individual holds something you really want to perpetuate? Not always the case. Given that it is, let's start by looking at the effective, let's take some measurements. Let's measure the business process effectiveness. Now, so when at the end, we can compare it and we can evaluate how well we did. Now, I didn't go into the various methodologies and we lump those all under knowledge elicitation and transfer, and there are a wide range of techniques and methods here. But my focus was on treat this as a business process. This is part of your business process. It's done for a business reason because it impacts the productivity and effectiveness of your organization, and it has specific metrics and outputs. And we took that approach across the board. But the other thing that I tried to bring out to people is, a lot of knowledge capture is, let's document everything. You hear tacit and explicit. Well, years ago, I was approached by the Department of Energy. And as part of their long-term stewardship responsibilities for nuclear waste, somehow they thought, well, maybe we should bring some KM people in here. And one of the first things I discovered in working with them was there are two approaches. There's knowledge preservation and knowledge perpetuation. Preservation doesn't work. You cannot take knowledge, put it in an encapsulated form, and expect it to be reusable. It has to be perpetuated. And that brought out one of the characteristics of the technique we used was the recipient of the knowledge was part of the process. Through the elicitation, everything else, that knowledge transfer, yes, we were trying to create explicit stores and, and capture that knowledge, but from day one, through the entire process, you had the knowledge recipient involved, because sooner or later, they're going to be on the other end. And every time around, as long as you have the recipients involved in that process, they will help refine and perpetuate that process to the point, we would hope, we haven't seen this yet, that it became an embedded characteristic of doing business. And you got past the fact that it was something you stopped to do, and it just became part of the way you did business.
Well, thanks, Bo. The next topic that I'd like to bring up relates to converting employees to knowledge workers. I believe that one of the key principles behind the Knowledge Sciences Center is recognizing that we're well on our way as an economy of developing a knowledge-based economy, and how important that is not just here, but in global companies around the world. At ConocoPhillips, I have an ample definition of a knowledge worker. You don't want to offend anybody. That's my belief. I want to keep everybody in. And for us, I define it simply, anybody who's adding shareholder value. And I try to be as inclusive as possible. Over time, we've learned that that's just the best way. We want to definitely include all generations across our cultures. Over half of our population as employees speak English as a second or third language. All are welcome. That's a message that we've sent. My question is, how can we work with organizations, public and private, to take and recognize and move employees who may have thought, oh, I'm just doing this or I'm just doing that, to be a little bit more ample, a little bit more broad-based knowledge workers. And let's flip the order and start with Bo.
Okay. I think one of the important things to be able to recognize the value the knowledge worker brings is, in essence, recognizing the knowledge they bring to every activity they do. And part of that means you really have to understand their contribution to the activities. Now, knowledge is an enabler of every action and decision within a business process. It's a key asset, but we don't do knowledge asset management from the same perspective we do physical assets. But if we were able to understand that in hiring Holly as a contractor or as a consultant to come in, you're buying knowledge, you're acquiring knowledge. You may get some of it as retained knowledge, but some of it may be just one-time use. That's the nature of bringing consultants in. Employees are a different matter. Now you're trying to maintain that. And if you look at this knowledge, the asset life cycle, and the role the employees have in that, and the knowledge workers have in that, their value becomes apparent. They are now part of the asset. And recognition for that can flow very easily. Right now, we can't recognize them for it because we don't know how much we spend on knowledge acquisition, retention, transfer, and use. But if the business perspective, which is the financial perspective, can be translated directly to the knowledge worker's contribution to that life cycle, now you've got a good foundation for your rewards program. And it also contributes to how do they fit into that perpetuation.
So you can help define that WIFM, that what's in it for me, with a reward and recognition, and demonstrating the right types of behaviors will be indeed rewarded.
Yeah. Yes, I think that would go very well.
Madeline, can you build on that?
I love the fact that you make such a broad definition of a knowledge worker. Oftentimes we think of the knowledge worker as again, someone who is an intellectual, when in fact human beings have been knowledge workers from day one. Anybody here an organic farmer? You eat organic food, that's pretty good. To be an organic farmer requires an enormous amount of knowledge. I've done it for 30 years. It's an enormous amount of knowledge to do it. And yet our ancestors were organic farmers long enough and well enough that we're here today. So I love the fact that we've expanded. The person you bring your automobile to is also a knowledge worker. I did it until it sounded right. That's knowledge. I also liked your point about creating an environment where people are interested and become curious about things. I like to use the word curious because it really is when people are, that's what children are. They are curious about things. So how can you create an environment where people become curious? And that means that they have to be willing to say what's on their mind, to make a mistake, and not get beaten by it. I don't want to go on this for too long, but if I could go on all day. But I think that's the critical thing when you're talking about creating this idea of everybody being a knowledge worker. They have to recognize they have knowledge to bring, and you have to make it a place where learning and curiosity is not only permitted but even encouraged.
How do you motivate them? And Dan, you said shareholder or contributing to the bottom line, basically. Then there's the civilian sector, or the civil sector side. How do you motivate the civil sector employee? Patriotism is another way to motivate the knowledge worker. But how do you get them involved? I think probably one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is provide them access to corporate knowledge in the workplace. And of course, from the technology standpoint, which I'm thinking of, you need to, of course, provide different types of knowledge. You have the structured knowledge, we're all aware of, which the numbered punchers work with, and then you have the unstructured knowledge of written prose. And there are various analytics tools that the worker can use to access that, and there are the structured data, and then there are other semantic search tools that the workers can use for the unstructured piece. But you need to provide them access, ready access to it, and it needs to be fast. And they need to be able to find what they're looking for quickly, and then be able to share what they've learned. So you have to employ some type of a workflow tool to gather that information. And how would you do that? First of all, on the corporate sector, well, we all have servers. We have huge server farms, or we have our cloud computing centers at the corporate level, and we all have our SharePoint sites, and it works just great for the corporation as long as we're willing to sign up for it. But how do you do it at the community level? I mean, people in our community are knowledge workers. Especially the example that Mills Davis provided about the welfare workflow. You think about those who don't have access. We need to provide access to everyone somehow, and everyone should have a mobile device. That's how the emergency system is communicating with everyone now. So is there a way to tailor our knowledge bases to reach everyone?
Great. I think a lot of people have said really interesting things here about how broadly we define what that knowledge worker looks like. And I think something else we need to talk about is as we look at kind of the academic side in education, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, that different organizations define that differently, and each organization has its own processes. They have their different technologies. They have their different content they're working with, and different organizational structures, and different leadership, and different cultures. And how can we provide support for that and be adaptable to those different needs that different organizations have? How can we provide research to learn from best practices of other organizations and bring some of those new ideas in while supporting the structures they have, so you get some of that people who are willing to adopt it and motivate people, because they're like, oh, not everything's changing at once. Some of this is familiar, and I'm kind of seeing where I can go forward on that path.
I'd like to tell, to enrich what we just heard, a story at ConocoPhillips and it relates to having an ample definition and encouraging that inclusivity. I was a consultant for about 20 years, and I transitioned in January 2006, and I took the job as the Director of Knowledge Sharing at ConocoPhillips. Now, there's a difference. Maybe some of you in this room have transitioned in this direction. I know some of you have. I know Mike, I used to work with from Ernst & Young. He's made a transition in the other direction. But when you're accountable for something, then all of a sudden, everything changes. It did for me. How do you make this work? And when we're talking about behavior and culture here, it becomes a very difficult thing. My ecosystem, how can I get this to work? How can I get the sponsors? That clay layer, I call it. I was telling Edwin during the break, those are the mid-level managers. I got to get them on board because they're controlling people's day jobs, the time and space, sending that message. So my very first trip in ConocoPhillips as an employee was in January of 2006. I went up to Alaska. And this guy that was taking me around, his name was Steve. Any baseball fans in the room? Steve looked like Bert Blyleven in his prime. He had that big beard. Remember Bert Blyleven, great curveball pitcher? Minnesota, had a cup of coffee with the tribe. Steve was taking me around. Now, Steve worked in Anchorage. Our operations in Alaska are on the North Slope. We share an airplane with BP. We fly up, back and forth a couple times. It's a 90-minute flight per day. We pull about 260,000 barrels off the North Slope on a daily basis. Comes down through the pipeline, goes out through the McKinsey Delta. I went up there, and the first thing I saw, I'm Dan, I'm this pencil neck consultant trying to make this work, trying to figure things out, trying to blend in, these are a bunch of engineers. And we're up there, and we're in our operations center, and it's so doggone loud. These turbines are running like you would not believe. And we go outside, you got to wear ear protection. And I'm trying to talk to Steve, I'm trying to ask him questions, and you're literally screaming. It's like you're right next to an airplane engine, okay? And we go inside, and I see all of these guys at this, like it looks like a Star Trek type of operation. And what are they doing? They're working. They're knowledge workers. I was thinking to myself, they're monitoring all of the activity. I mean, as long as all the production is going great, this place looks like it runs on its own. And they're in there, and they're watching these things, and they're drinking coffee. And I said, it's quieter then because we're inside. I said, Steve, these are the people we need to get on we call our communities of practice networks of excellence. Or no, I said, Steve, we need to get them on. Steve looks at me and he goes, oh, no, Dan. Steve is known as a townie. A townie in our vernacular means that you're one of those managers that works in the town. The town operations and wherever they are around the world is usually quite a ways, a lot of times, from the actual operations. Steve goes, no, Dan, we'll be the ones on those networks of excellence. We got those covered. I said, okay, Steve, I'm not going to say, no, Steve, you're wrong. I'm just Dan from Cleveland, Ohio. You're a tough audience. And so we worked and worked and worked, and we had this success story program where we collected testimonials across time zones. And as things turned out, and we had an economic impact associated with it, we were trying to teach people that, this is knowledge sharing, this is a simple story, this is the difference that I can make when I act and operate like part of a global company in estimated net cash flow terms, dollars. We had the biggest success story that we've ever had in the history of ConocoPhillips. It came from two guys up there monitoring these turbines that, quite frankly, didn't even have a college degree. They're technically, you can make a lot of money in Alaska, but they're up there and they're running this stuff. They shared this information with an operation we had just offshore China in Bohai Bay and saved, this is a real calculation, $87.5 million. That story, we got a lot of mileage out of it, and it shook the foundation of what I'm talking about. Spin forward 2 years, and I'm up there, and ironically, Steve, his name's Steve Cruz, great guy. He was the same guy that was taking around. We flew up to the North Slope together, went to all our operations, and Steve has a great memory. I think I have a good memory, and as soon as we got up there, we were in the same place, and Steve looked at me and he said, Dan, I remember what I said to you 2 years ago. I want to tell you what we've learned. That getting these employees in a more inclusive way, included in the process, and sharing knowledge and encouraging them to participate and drive business value was the right thing to do. Let's be inclusive. I think that's a key message, regardless of your private sector, public sector, that inclusivity, because everybody, heart and soul, you mean that commitment, they want to be engaged in what it is that you're doing. So I know I'm the moderator of the panel, and now I'm just pontificating, but I think it was a good story and it related to what we're talking about. Here's a question I have. I'm going to go off the board, and it blends all of these concepts together. I know that we've had our own journey up and down in terms of getting the right sponsorship. How do you get those sponsors to set the tone for a collaborative learning organization? How can you get into that C-suite and down below and make sure that they're going to be out there and supporting and with the right messaging, the right elevator speeches. I'll start over here with Holly. How can you get, that's a key piece of a lot of organizations.
I agree that that's a huge piece, because so many times what I've seen in organizations is that some kind of command comes down from the top. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to use. And who are the first people to break it? Usually the leadership. They're like, I don't have time to do it. I don't have the time to learn a new system. I don't have the time to do that, but I expect all of you to. And I think one of the things that we've kind of learned is if you can start and get some buy-in in the middle, so you're pushing it both up and down through the organization at the same time, it's been successful. Because then what you have is you have it moving both directions. Leadership starting to see that, hey, I'm getting a little bit of pull here and it's working and it's saving me time. And they have the people that are under them seeing, wow, it's saving them time, I think I'll do it. And pushing it down, they start seeing everyone in the organization, and they start to get a little bit of more of that buy-in. So how do you go to them and say, well, we should do this? Well, most of the time they want to say, well, what money is it going to save me? What time is it going to save me? What resources is it going to save me? And if you go in with that story from the beginning, and you can share stories like Dan just did here, it does amazing things for getting that buy-in and getting stakeholders.
Getting the buy-in. That's the hardest part. And somehow you've got to educate the folks at the action, I'll call them the action officer level, that's the government terminology. The guys that run the rabbit trails, the guys that do all the roll up the sleeves and where the rubber meets the road work. You've got to be able to convince them first. And the way to do that, at least the way I've managed to be able to promote semantic technology with my customers, is to identify a use case, and that, for those of you who've done the systems development work, it's an example of how the technology will help them accelerate their work. You develop a use case, you do a quick prototype with any type of technology you might have at hand that could illustrate the value. You build it, and then you start showing it off. And nothing speaks like a demonstration. We all know that. You demonstrate it, and the light bulbs go on. You start talking about semantic technology, or knowledge management, or knowledge capture, or expert systems. You show them an example, they get it. And then you get their support. And then management understands, my workforce sees value in this. And possibly through the demonstration, you can show efficiencies, which we've managed to be able to do with some of our work. So you've got to sell the workforce on it. And demos are the best way to go, I think, as long as you get the funding. You got to get the funding.
I'm really in a very lucky position because I'm not working with a client until they call me in to work with them. And why do they call me in? Because they have some pain. And so as long as I can speak to the pain, they're on board. When I start promoting something that's my idea and I can't relate to the pain, it's just not going to sell. So and I recall when I was an executive myself, she slipped away. Denise mentioned that I had been at the World Bank. I ran a rather large division. And unless somebody could say to me, this is the benefit to you, they got nothing back, absolutely nothing. So it really has to do with really understanding where their objectives are and their goals. And sometimes that means listening for the deeper need, not just profits, speed, whatever.
Thank you all. That's a question I've been having all along. How the heck do you get the buy-in? The agency I've been working with recently, typical case, we brought in under contract to create a KM program. Well, I didn't ask them what flavor of KM are you practicing. They looked at me and said, "What's KM?" And it was tabula rasa time. But that same question went all the way up to the top. Now, what I have found, and I can address more how you don't look for your sponsors, because I can tell you what hasn't worked. First of all, don't expect the sponsor to see the full picture, especially in this case. It's like Aesop's elephant. Your sponsors are going to have grabbed a leg or a tail, and they're going to call that KM. And while they may have pain, whether or not they'll communicate that pain to you is another question. What they're more likely to do is say, "I have a pain, and here's how I want you to solve that." They're going to come to you and ask you to implement a solution that they think, based upon the part of the elephant they grab, should answer their question. Now, you're quite fortunate if that's the solution, that's your skill set, that's what you're able to bring to them, that works, and they were accurate. But that's an iffy game. So make sure, I guess my recommendation in finding your sponsor, wherever it comes within the hierarchy, first of all, they've got to be able to drive change. They have to be in a decision-making position. Starting at the top works great if they've got the attention span for it. But make sure they understand what it is that they're actually, what's the problem they're actually trying to solve. How the outcome can be observed in relationship to that problem. You know, asking to see a financial ROI on cultural change, you know, that's tough. Make sure that the metric that they're using to measure the benefit matches the activity. And make sure that, you know, they've got, I don't want to say, the term holistic's overused, but make sure they do have that full, broader understanding of just what this means within the organization. That's my recommendation.
Thank you. What is our time commitment here? Help me out with the agenda. How much longer do we have? 5 minutes? Okay. Is that the official agenda, or how long you personally want us to keep going? I'm kidding you. I'm kidding you. 10 times faster. How do you, oh, we started 15 minutes late, according to one of our esteemed panelists. 10 times faster. How do we accelerate that journey? I'm not going to go on and on this one. I'm going to throw it to the panel. I've got a lot of great examples, but and let's just kind of round robin it and keep it tight. Bo, 30 seconds or less. How can we accelerate that journey? What's your best idea?
Expand the option space. If whatever you're doing, it's going to, you're going to accelerate. You're going to be looking at things that you haven't looked at before. You need to expand that option space. Be extremely careful of any practice that smacks of reductionism.
Alvin Toffler said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those people who cannot read and write. The illiterate of the 21st century will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I love the fact that unlearn has already made it onto the stage, into this area. The way you unlearn is to be talking with someone else who is asking you questions. Nancy Klein wrote a book called Time to Think, and she describes what she called a thinking partner. And that was their job, was to unearth your assumptions, the hidden assumptions that we never see. I call it a practice partner in my work. Same thing. These are people who ask you questions to unearth those unseen assumptions.
I have one. From the technology side, I have to say knowledge management standards. I have been integrating computer systems for 30 years using 80-column cards, EDI, XML. You all have heard of those standards before. And unless you have a standard, you can't communicate. And I know, I think Mills and Dr. Hanna had some slides up that identified XML, RDF, and OWL. There's also microformat, which I think is another issue unto itself. But those types of formats should be standard to enable HTTPS, HTML, which of course is managed by the W3C. Sign up for standards.
Okay, I'm going to go the opposite side of technology and talk about building some mental models through surrogate experience. And by that I mean when you first learn, you learn the basic skills, and then you learn to internalize those skills. And what we need to do is give people opportunity to think about how they would react to a situation. So you may not be able to go out in the field every time, but if we can say, here's what happened, here's a challenge, what would you do? And you're forced to think through that. And the more times you're forced to think through these situations, when you actually face a novel situation, you're more readily able to handle it.
Well, I'm going to close us out with a mini story, trying to keep to my 30 seconds. I'm just a fast-talking, carpetbagging Yankee. That's what they call me in Texas, at least. February, when I'm not working, I coach a basketball team, 17, 18-year-olds. And I was coaching. I was at practice. I get a call, strange number. Who's calling me? It was Matt Fox. Matt Fox is on our executive leadership team. I picked up the phone. It was a good thing I answered. I went, hey, how you doing? I went, Matt, what are you calling me for? He said, I'm going in front of the analyst tomorrow in New York City, and I want to be able to say how many times I've learned the most admired knowledge enterprise award, because I want to make sure that he knows knowledge sharing is a strategic differentiator for ConocoPhillips. I'm like, holy smokes, can you believe this guy's asking me this question? I mean, you talk about making it to the C-suite. You talk about getting in there and being seen as a strategic differentiator. And it doesn't mean it's the end of our journey, but it means that you're making great progress in terms of blending business value with the behaviors and developing a collaborative culture. So that was probably more than 30 seconds, but every one of my stories is. So I'd like to close us out by asking you to punctuate this panel's performance with a round of applause.